Hello, my friends. Vladimir Putin has been absolutely clear from the beginning. Russia will secure the Donbass, either through negotiations or by force. That's not a new position. It's a consistent one. What is new is that the battlefield reality has finally caught up with the political fantasy in the West. Russia can do exactly what Putin says it will do, and the longer Western governments cling to their illusions, the more Ukrainians they condemn to unnecessary, painful deaths. That's the brutal truth most Western leaders refuse to face. From the Russian side, the fundamentals have not changed. No NATO membership for Ukraine, security guarantees for Russia, and recognition of the reality on the ground. In that sense, parts of the much-discussed 28-point peace plan coming out of Trump's orbit do mark a step forward. Washington is, at least on paper, acknowledging that Ukraine will not join NATO and that Russia is not leaving Donbass. That's a huge shift from the early war rhetoric. But buried in that plan is a poison pill, leaving 15-20% of the contested territory in some ambiguous halfway house status and allowing Ukraine to maintain a standing army of some 600,000 troops. That is not a peace plan. It is the recipe for the next war. You do not end a conflict by freezing in place the very conditions that caused it, then arming the losing side to the teeth and pretending that's stability. From Moscow's perspective, that is totally unacceptable, and rightly so. Look at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. For Russia, that is not a negotiable bargaining chip. It is an existential security issue. The idea that this asset sitting on Russia's doorstep, tied to enriched nuclear fuel, would end up under some vague international control or worse, back under Kyiv's authority or effectively under NATO's umbrella, is a red line. Russia will not permit hostile forces or a Western-controlled peacekeeping fig leaf to sit atop a nuclear facility that can be used as leverage or sabotage. Based on everything that has transpired, the sabotage campaigns, the terrorist attacks, the constant escalation, Moscow has already made its decision. Zaporozhye will remain in Russian hands, one way or another. Putin's recent public statements, especially the ones delivered in uniform in front of his military commanders, are not rhetorical theater. They are strategic signaling. When he talks about the unconditional achievement of the objectives of the special military operation, that is not a slogan. It means Russia will finish the job in Donbass and the other territories it has claimed on a timeline and in a manner of its own choosing. When he says in plain language that Russia will take it all, one way or the other, he is not improvising. He is restating what has been Russia's position since before February 2022. This is a security operation, not a PR exercise, and Moscow will not be talked out of its core interests by Western spin. At the same time, Putin has gone out of his way to draw a sharp distinction between Ukraine and Europe. He has said repeatedly, Russia has no intention of attacking Europe. There are no plans in Moscow to march on Berlin or Paris. But if Europe starts a war, if European governments back preemptive strikes on Russian territory, as some deranged generals have suggested, Russia is ready right now to respond. And his warning is chillingly simple. Such a war will be short, brutal, and decisive. In other words, there may not be anyone left on the European side with whom to negotiate afterwards. That is not bluster. It is the sober calculation of a state that has already wargamed every airbase, every missile site, every ammunition depot across Europe. Make no mistake, just as NATO maintains its own target lists in Russia, Russia has a bank of priority targets across Europe. Airfields, logistics hubs, arms factories, depot clusters. If European leaders ever decide to cross the Rubicon from proxy war to open war, those sites will be the first to go. And from that point, you are on the threshold of thermonuclear escalation. Putin's message is essentially, stop playing games with language like preemptive strike and war with Russia. You're talking yourselves into something you cannot survive. On top of this, Moscow has carefully priced in the political volatility in Washington under both Biden and now Trump. Russia watched the Biden administration promise in December 2021 not to station offensive missiles in Ukraine, and then do a complete U-turn once the war broke out. That betrayal set the tone for Moscow's view of U.S. reliability. Zero trust, maximum verification. So today, even as Russia keeps lines of communication open with Washington, it does so with its eyes wide open, assuming every assurance out of the White House or State Department is reversible on short notice. This is where Trump's envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff enter the picture. From Trump's perspective, the key criterion is loyalty. These are people he trusts personally after years of being undermined by his own appointees. Loyalty matters to him far more than diplomatic experience or historical knowledge. Politically, that may be understandable. Strategically, it's a huge liability, because what you need to stitch together a durable end to this war is not just a few trusted insiders flying to Moscow. You need a serious diplomatic machine. You would need heavyweight scholars and negotiators, people like John Mearsheimer and others, who actually understand the history of NATO expansion, the security architecture of Europe, and Russia's red lines sent to every major capital. Berlin, Paris, Rome, Warsaw, Budapest, Kiev, even into the Democratic Party and the anti-Trump wing of the U.S. establishment. You need buy-in. You need charm, patience, and deep historical grounding. This is not some real estate closing. It is a generational peace settlement that will decide the shape of Europe for decades. Trump's team is trying to skip that entire layer. They are writing off Brussels as irrelevant, ignoring Kyiv's political realities, and hoping that go straight to Moscow and cut a deal will be enough. It won't be. You can shut Europe out of the early conversations if you want, but you can't keep them out forever. NATO is Europe. Ukraine is sitting on Europe's eastern flank. If you don't build a coalition that can sell a peace deal at home, that deal will be sabotaged from within. Moscow understands this. Washington, under Trump, still does not. And that's exactly why Russia is so comfortable playing the long game. They know that every month that passes, their position on the battlefield improves, while the West's political position erodes. Trump himself admits it. He has said openly that if the West doesn't make a deal now, it will lose more territory later. Russia hears that and concludes correctly that Washington has already internalized the eventual outcome. The U.S. knows Ukraine is losing. It knows Russia will not be pushed back to the 1,991 borders. But the U.S. cannot control its European allies, who are still caught up in their own fantasies about strategic defeat for Moscow. Look at Europe's behavior. Locked out of serious talks with Russia by Trump's inner circle, European elites are now flailing around on their own, making wild statements about preparing for war with Russia by 2027 or 2029. Italian generals talk about preemptive strikes. German ministers float conscription and massive rearmament. French leaders posture about being ready for a direct confrontation. This is political theater, untethered from military reality. Putin's answer was brutally clear. Russia does not plan to fight Europe, but if Europe starts a war, Russia is ready, and the conflict will escalate faster than European capitals can imagine. Behind all this posturing is a deeper structural shift, the end of transatlantic solidarity. Under Biden, the U.S. and Europe moved in lockstep. NATO could have kept this proxy war running indefinitely, repackaging endless aid schemes, lend-lease frameworks, sanctions, and security packages that kept the bleeding going in Ukraine without changing the outcome. With Trump back, that system is breaking down. Trump and his allies, like J.D. Vance, have openly berated Europe at forums like the Munich Security Conference, attacking European leaders for censorship, hypocrisy, and free speech suppression. Trump himself has humiliated Zelensky in public. The sacred cow of transatlantic unity has been slaughtered. Russia is exploiting this ruthlessly. Moscow understands the fissures between Washington and Europe better than the West does itself. Where Biden enforced unity, Trump injects chaos. Where Europe once believed it had an American blank check, it now faces a U.S. that might cut a side deal with Russia and leave Brussels holding the bag. That fear is behind reports of Macron privately warning that the U.S. could betray Ukraine through these negotiations. The French know perfectly well that Trump is capable of turning to Kyiv and saying, "You lost live with it." while he focuses on cutting energy and security deals with Moscow. Yet even Trump cannot fully walk away. The U.S. is too entangled politically, militarily, and through its NATO proxies like Britain and certain Eastern European states. You see this clearly in the pattern of escalation: attacks on Russian shipping in the Black Sea, drone attacks on infrastructure, sabotage operations that clearly involve British and possibly French assistance. These are not spontaneous Ukrainian actions. They are part of a broader Western effort to keep Russia off balance. Ironically, each one of these provocations only strengthens Moscow's case for expanding its operations around Kherson, Zaporozhye, Mykolaiv, and eventually Odessa. Every time Russia pauses, the West uses the pause to escalate. That lesson has been burned into the Kremlin's memory. This is why Russia stopped taking Western rhetoric at face value. In the early stages of the conflict, Moscow was willing to treat Western breakthrough moments, talks in Istanbul, sudden ceasefire whispers, as opportunities to de-escalate. Each time, the Russian side paused, and each time it was rewarded with escalation. New weapons packages, new red lines crossed, new acts of sabotage. The conclusion is obvious. Western elites are not looking for a negotiated settlement. They are looking for ways to bleed Russia and prolong the war, regardless of Ukrainian losses. Meanwhile, Europe's political class is still living in a propaganda bubble when it comes to Russia's capabilities. They repeat, like a mantra, that Russia is a spent force that has supposedly gained only 1% more territory in Ukraine since 2022. Clowns like Pompeo parrot those talking points. They pretend that Russia has failed strategically, even as the front lines slowly but steadily move in Moscow's favor. They ignore Putin's repeated public statements that Russia has deliberately avoided leveling Ukraine, choosing a slower, more surgical approach to preserve civilian life and infrastructure where possible. That nuance doesn't fit the cartoon narrative of a barbaric Russia, so it simply disappears from Western media. Then there is Ursula von der Leyen, loudly proclaiming that pressure is the only language the Kremlin understands, promising that Europe will arm Ukraine until it can negotiate from a position of strength. This is magical thinking. There is no explanation, no roadmap for how a depleted, demographically collapsing, economically shattered Ukraine, already losing ground, suddenly flips the military balance against a mobilized, industrially ramped up Russia. They chant slogans about reparations from Russia, seizing frozen Russian assets, and financing Ukraine's reconstruction with Moscow's money, even as their own central bankers quietly admit the scheme is legally and financially untenable. The European central bank's refusal to fully back the theft of Russian reserves was a body blow. The fairy tale about a leprechaun's chest of gold at the end of the rainbow waiting to fund Ukraine indefinitely has collapsed. Russia has already written off those frozen assets. If Moscow ever got them back, they'd likely be canceled out by Western demands for reparations anyway. So from Russia's perspective, that supposed leverage simply doesn't exist. What's left then? Either Europe prints the money, fueling inflation, austerity, and an even worse debt-to-GDP spiral, or it admits it cannot bankroll this war. The politicians naturally choose to bluff. They keep talking about stamina, resolve, staying the course. But notice the small tells, the Ukrainian flags quietly disappearing from desks in European parliaments, the voters' fatigue, the rising populist anger. Everyone in Europe is looking for an exit ramp, but no one wants to admit it publicly. By contrast, Washington can ultimately wash its hands of the mess and still profit. The U.S. has effectively seized a monopoly position, supplying LNG to Europe at premium prices. It has turned Europe into a captive energy market while simultaneously driving European industry into decline by cutting off cheap Russian gas. Ursula von der Leyen brags about energy independence from Russia, but she doesn't mention that Europe has simply traded affordable Russian supplies for far more expensive American ones. Independence from Moscow has become dependence on U.S. exporters, and the price is Europe's deindustrialization. And let's be clear, it was not Russia that weaponized energy. It was the United States. Russia supplied Europe reliably For decades, it was Washington that pushed for Nord Stream's destruction, after Biden himself stood next to Olaf Scholz and promised to end the pipeline. It is Washington that now uses energy as leverage to dictate European foreign policy. The very accusation they hurled at Moscow politicizing energy has become their own primary tool of control. If there were any strategic intelligence left in Europe's political class, or in the so-called populist right, they would seize on this scandal as the central issue. The United States has bankrupted Germany and crippled European industry under the guise of protecting them from Russia. A serious European movement would demand a reckoning, name names, and rebuild relations with Moscow on sober, pragmatic terms. Whether such a movement emerges remains to be seen. Trump, if he were the strategic statesman his followers imagine, would also go to work on this. He could crucify Biden not with slogans, but with specific facts. Biden's Nord Stream threats, his broken promise on offensive missiles in Ukraine, his role in forcing Europe off Russian energy and into dependence on overpriced U.S. LNG. Each of these decisions fed directly into Russia's hardened security posture and its insistence on written, enforceable guarantees. Connecting those dots would not only expose Biden's responsibility for the war, it would also explain why Russia is now absolutely uncompromising on its core demands. Instead, Trump is wandering like a minotaur in a maze of his own making, sending loyal but inexperienced envoys to Moscow, admiring the sealing art in the Kremlin, and imagining that a few photo ops and vague frameworks will deliver peace. This requires serious statecraft, the kind of cold-blooded strategic vision once associated with figures like Kissinger, minus the cynicism, or Brzezinski, minus the globalist empire building. It requires an understanding of where power really lies, where the red lines are, and how to make every party swallow a settlement they don't fully like but can live with. Trump doesn't have that team. And that is one of the biggest structural weaknesses in the current Western approach. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, the political center is beginning to crack. Zelensky has lost key figures in his inner circle, men like Yermak, who was widely regarded as his brain. Yermak was not just a chief of staff, he was the filter, the scriptwriter, the gatekeeper. Every speech Zelensky read off his phone, every emotional address to parliaments and award shows, every fundraising tour was shaped and vetted through that office. Zelensky was kept in an information bubble, treated less like a president and more like an actor playing the role of wartime leader-in-chief, whose job description was fundraising money, weapons, aid, rather than governing. Yermak, however, is no fool. He built a dense network of control and gathered substantial compromat, including the infamous leaked recordings between Biden and Poroshenko. Those tapes didn't magically appear. They were the product of a Ukrainian system in which everything was recorded and archived and then scooped up and weaponized when power changed hands. That gives people like Yermak enormous insurance. They know where the bodies are buried, politically and literally. Now that he is gone or sidelined, Zelensky may be facing reality for the first time without that filter. We saw hints of this when the latest corruption scandal erupted and Zelensky made a vague, uncharacteristic statement about needing to make big decisions for the country's history. It was not the usual scripted defiance. It sounded like a man beginning to grasp that the game is slipping out of his control. But it is almost certainly too late. Behind the scenes, the British have played a disproportionate role in stage managing Zelensky's public persona, messaging, imagery, PR, choreography, even aspects of his security and travel. London has long had a bridesmaid waiting in the wings, Valery Zaluzhny, the general they once hoped to parachute into power as the trusted military savior who could command the army and placate the far-right nationalist battalions. On paper, it looked like a neat succession plan. When Zelensky becomes too toxic, swap him for Zaluzhny via a managed election or a soft coup. But that plan was drawn up in a different phase of the war. Today, the situation has deteriorated so badly militarily, socially, politically, that no one can say with confidence that anyone can control the neo-Nazi and ultra-nationalist elements that have been unleashed inside Ukraine. If London still thinks it can simply insert Zaluzhny as a stabilizing figure, they are deluding themselves. The dogs of war they helped arm and legitimize do not go back quietly into the kennel. So where does all this leave us? With a Europe that is politically shattered, economically weakened, and strategically humiliated, with a United States that wants to walk away from a project of Ukrainian destabilization it has pursued since the late 1940s through OSS, CIA, Operation Aerodynamic, and ultimately the Maidan coup in 2014, but cannot exit cleanly. And with a Russia that has learned through bitter experience that the West will use every pause, every peace initiative as cover for escalation. The ultimate irony is this: the long-running U.S. project to weaponize Ukraine against Russia has not only failed, it has boomeranged. Ukraine is on the path to fragmentation, a breakup that is now essentially irreversible. The U.S. wants out. Europe is stuck with the wreckage. And Russia, far from being contained, has emerged with hardened security, deeper strategic ties to the global South, and a West that has exposed its own hypocrisy on everything from international law to energy policy. From where I sit, looking at the balance of forces, the political dynamics, and the economic underpinnings, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Russia will achieve its objectives in Ukraine. The only real question left is how many more Ukrainians and how much more of Europe's future will be sacrificed before Western leaders finally admit what Moscow understood from the start. You cannot defeat Russia in its own neighborhood on issues it defines as existential with slogans, sanctions, and propaganda. You either negotiate with reality or reality negotiates without you.